Well, it's good to be here. It's great to be among you. Since the start of the Tea Party movement, I've had opportunities to come and visit with this group a number of times. The last 4 years, I've been with Tea Party Patriots, and so I have been traveling a whole lot, and as of a few months ago, I'm no longer with them. And so it's kind of nice to be back home again and be able to focus a little bit more on what's happening. And so I want to talk to you a little bit tonight about, as Shane's already introduced, speaking the language of liberty. But before I want to do that, I want to share a story with you. How many of you have been to Boston? All right, quite a few of you. Now, when you went to Boston, did you take the Freedom Trail? You know that red painted line or the red inlaid brick that goes all through Old Town Boston, and you're able to walk along this self-guided tour. And if you start on one end, you start at Breed's Hill, where the Battle of Bunker Hill took place. Or if you go a little bit further down the street and over the bridge, you'll come to the Old North Church, where the famous 2 lanterns hung, indicating that the British would be leaving by water rather than by land. And then if you go a little further, you'll come to Paul Revere's home. Now, when Paul Revere moved into that home, it was already about 100 years old. So it's very interesting going and seeing that old home in Old Town Boston. Now, along the Freedom Trail, you'll come to a number of cemeteries along the way. And there's one of particular interest. It's the old Granary Cemetery. Now, you'll see the most recognizable names in this cemetery than any of the others, because there's some very important people there. When you first walk in, you take a right, and there off to the left is Samuel Adams, father of the American Revolution. And then you go a little bit further, and you'll see Paul Revere. Now, there's 3 or 4 Paul Reveres buried, so you got to make sure you get the right one. And then you've got John Hancock over on one side, and then right in the middle of the whole cemetery is this big obelisk for the Franklins. Now, this isn't Benjamin Franklin. This is Benjamin Franklin's parents. See, Benjamin Franklin's buried in Philadelphia. His parents were there in Boston, and he was just born and baptized pretty much right across the street in the Old South Church. Now, the Old South Church during the 1700s was the tallest and largest building in all of Boston. But in 1746, during what came to be known as King George's War, it was this large gathering place that the colonists would often get together. And they would gather there for important meetings, not just church meetings. And in 1746, they got word that the French had sent nearly 100 ships to come and burn the coastal cities of America. And the colonists were quite concerned because they didn't have the cannons and the guns and the manpower and the armaments and things that they needed in order to fight off this large French armada. And so they turned to the only weapon they had, a weapon that they had to turn to quite often. The governor of Massachusetts declared a universal day of fasting and prayer. And on the appointed day, the colonists in Boston gathered together at the Old South Church. It was Reverend Thomas Prince's turn to officiate at that high pulpit that day, and there were hundreds of people, some people even say thousands of people gathered on the outside and crowding on the inside, looking through the windows and the doors. And Reverend Prince began to pray before hundreds. He said, "O God, we ask thee to raise thy right hand and scatter the ships of our tormentors and drive them hence." He said, "Sink those proud frigates to the bottom of thy deep." And he went on to pray like this for quite some time, until all of a sudden the room began to darken, and the shutters began to violently slam against the walls. And the bell atop the tower of the old church began to ring erratically. And Reverend Prince paused for a moment. He bowed his head, and when he looked up, tears were streaming down his face. And he raised his hands high above his head. "O God, we hear thee. We hear thy voice, O Lord, we hear it. Thy breath is upon the waters from the eastward. Thy bell tolls for the death of our enemies." Now, how did he know what was going on? Of course, he didn't have a cell phone. Okay, yeah, those ships are going down, right? No, he just felt like God was answering their prayers. And sure enough, about a week and a half later, the colonists had gotten word that a virtual hurricane had risen out of the Atlantic and had sunken nearly every one of those French ships, and those that remained limped back to the West Indies from whence they came. Boston wasn't burned. Charleston wasn't burned. New York wasn't burned. God had once again preserved the colonists from utter destruction. Isn't that a great story? Our history has stories like that scattered all throughout our history. And we used to have those stories in our textbooks. In fact, that very story used to be in textbooks. And I think we're robbing our youth. We're robbing our youth of history, how it really was. History, how it was by those who lived it, right? Instead, now we just tell them to memorize the names and dates, and it's boring, and many people think history is boring. But anybody who you talk to that loved history as a kid, it's always because they had a good history teacher, right? That made it come alive. And so I think we're robbing our youth of history, how it was, by those who lived it. Now, I tell you this story about this event that took place along the Freedom Trail to tell you that today, I think right now, we are blazing a new freedom trail. We are on the cusp of what I believe to be a restoration of constitutional purity. It's amazing the awakening that we've had over the last 6 years or so. The number of Americans that have woken up and have realized, what made us wake up, first of all? What caused this movement to start 6 years ago?
The election of Barack Obama.
Okay, that's what the media tells us. But what started it? 9/11. No, not quite that far back. What? The crash. And then what happened after that? What did George Bush do? He stood up in that press conference and said, I am going to abandon free market principles to save the free market. And the bailouts, he unveiled all the bailouts, and all the Americans who are losing their jobs and getting pay cuts and all, they're looking around and saying, what in the world is this all about? This bailouts is ridiculous. And then Barack Obama gets elected, and he keeps the exact same policy, right? Stimulus packages, $1 trillion stimulus packages. And so that's when the people woke up and said, wow, this is craziness. And they woke up and they looked around and they said, we're not quite as free as our grandparents said we were. No big deal. We'll just tell Congress and the government we want our freedoms back. How well has that worked out for us? Would you say that we are more free or less free today than we were 6 years ago? Less free, absolutely. Yeah. But that's good news. And let me tell you why that's good news. Because whenever the people start rising up against tyrants, what do tyrants do? They always try to hold us down. And so they take more of our freedoms away. And that's precisely what's been happening to us, is the more we rise up, the more freedoms they have been taking away. Which it always creates an issue, especially among Americans. It escalates things, and Americans become fiercely independent. And it always ends up resulting, in the end, in more freedom. But first, we lose freedom. So it's good news, but we've got to keep it up, okay? Because if we don't keep it up, then we will go to sleep tomorrow having lost all those freedoms that we've lost the last 6 years. We've got to stay awake. We've got to keep progressing forward. But we're doing it. We've got them on the run, I guess, is the point I'm making. And it's a great thing. Now, speaking the language of liberty has become increasingly important because the media has been very, very good. The media and progressives. Now, my definition of a progressive only represents about 10 to 15% of the citizens of this country. They are people who believe in socialism or even as far as communism in its truest, fullest form. Very few Americans really believe in that. If you really start talking to like liberal Democrats and things, most of them want to be self-governing as well. They're just confused about some policies. And quite frankly, some people on the right are confused about some policies as well. And so these progressives, in order for them to gain ground, they've got to change, they've got to take control of the narrative, and they've done a great job. Boy, they have maligned the Tea Party, haven't they? You know, when the Tea Party first started, that first year and a half or so, 80 to 85% of the American people actually identified with the Tea Party. And then within just a year or two after that, it's now down to about 45% identify with the Tea Party. They've done a very good job at really maligning the Tea Party and dividing us and separating us. And it's because we don't quite understand how to speak the language. So a couple of years ago, I had been recently doing some studying on, doing a lot of research from the founders, reading a lot of their works and their letters and their letters primarily back and forth. And what I was studying was Article 5. And so I was really immersing myself into that subject because it had become a newer, up-and-coming subject. It's been a subject for 30 years or more. But it was kind of new and up-and-coming, so I had immersed myself in that, and I discovered that as I was doing that, my language was better. When I was communicating with others, I could communicate more fluidly these principles. And so I thought, we should put together a book that basically has some great quotes from the founders and some great ideas on how they spoke the language of liberty and some exercises that you could do every day. You could practice this language of liberty, and this book would help those of us in the movement speak the language. And so a friend of mine and I began to undertake this book. Many of you are familiar with the Center for Self-Governance. The president, Center for Self-Governance, is Mark Herr. So Mark Herr and I are working on this book, Language of Liberty. And as we got into it, we realized that it's far more than just the words you speak or the phrases that you use. We discovered that the language of liberty is much deeper than that. So here it is in a nutshell. I'm going to tell you exactly how you can learn how to speak the language of liberty. The first thing you need to do is study the Bible. Read it and reread it at least a half a dozen or more times. Then you need to study all the philosophers of freedom, Montesquieu, Cicero, Polybius, Blackstone, Locke, all these great philosophers of freedom. Read all their works at least 2 or 3 times. Then read all the founding fathers' works, their letters back and forth, all their writings and their debates in the Constitutional Convention, Federalist paper. Read all those a handful of times. And once you do that, you'll have it. All right, you're good. Easy? We discovered it's so much more difficult than that. There's so much more to the language of liberty. So we started looking into some of the words from Thomas Jefferson primarily, because wouldn't you agree that the Declaration is probably the best example of the language of liberty that we have, I believe, in all mankind, actually. It's just an amazing document. And so we started looking to Thomas Jefferson. Well, while that's getting going, I know the quote anyway. Thomas Jefferson, of course, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Now, I'm sure those words ring just as true to you as they do to me, and just as true as they did to Thomas Jefferson when he read words similar that were written almost 100 years earlier by John Locke. Now that quote I don't have memorized, so I'm hoping this comes up here soon. All right, I think we're up and running again now. Now let's see if I can just get my clicker going. There we go. So 100 years earlier, John Locke wrote, "The state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, and reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions." So as we read that quote, we can hear the similar tones that we heard in Thomas Jefferson's work. We hear the law of nature and of nature's God. We can hear self-evident truths. We hear that all men are created equal, and those fundamental rights of life, liberty, and property. So what is it that made it possible for these two individuals that are separated by 100 years, what made it possible for them to be able to speak this same language? Now, a crude interpretation of history would say that Thomas Jefferson simply read John Locke and copied him. Now, while that is true to a certain degree, it totally misses the mark on who Jefferson was and his life's work. Jefferson spent his entire life studying the philosophers of freedom, and then once he had studied those works, he tried to implement those principles in his own life and then tried to institute them in the state of Virginia and in his country. Now, he spent over 30 years trying to implement some of the most simple, self-evident truths in the state of Virginia. And so when we're into this thing 6 years now with this liberty movement, And so we shouldn't be too frustrated. Thomas Jefferson, one of the greatest minds in the principles of freedom and liberty, took him a lifetime to get some of those principles instituted. So let's talk a little bit about what he was able to accomplish. If we look at the Declaration of Independence, now can I have somebody from the back row start reading there? It's kind of small, huh? The purpose of this up here is not to read it, it's to illustrate something. The portions of the Declaration in yellow, those first two paragraphs and the conclusion, you can see are much smaller than that center portion in white. The center portion is the list of grievances. Now this is a list of grievances that a tyrannical king and parliament is their actions over a free people. Now we forget that we had a 160 plus year history in America prior to the Declaration of Independence. We had been free for the most part throughout that time. We had been practicing self-governance. We were left alone to a large degree. And so all of a sudden during the revolutionary period, that Parliament and the king decided to start putting on the pressure. And so this is a list of grievances a tyrannical king and Parliament had against a free people. So that should have just put a cloud of darkness over the document. But Jefferson's language in that first two paragraphs and that conclusion inspires people so greatly that it not only helps people recognize that there's not only great hope for America, but a great hope for all mankind. And so it shines this great light on that document. So let's talk a little bit about Jefferson and how he was able to do that in the Declaration of Independence. Toward the end of his life, Jefferson was asked by a friend, where did you get the actual language for the Declaration? Because he had been accused over the years of copying it from George Mason's Declaration of Virginia, Declaration of the Rights of Virginians, and then some other places. Like, for example, there's a book out there that talks about how Thomas Paine is the actual author of the Declaration of Independence, and he wasn't very popular, so Thomas Jefferson's name was put on it. And anyway, all these accusations, his time, our time, that Jefferson basically plagiarized much of the document. So here's what Jefferson said toward the end of his life. He said, this was the object of the Declaration of Independence, not to find out new principles or new arguments never before thought of, not merely to say things which had never been said before. So he wasn't trying to get a Nobel Prize here. He wasn't trying to find anything unique. He was actually trying to find things that were lasting and eternal. So he was doing the opposite of trying to find something unique. He was trying to find things that had been steady proofs over many, many years. He then goes on to say, but to place before mankind the common sense of the subject in terms so plain and so firm as to command their assent. Now, the moment I read this, the first thing that came to mind was self-evident truths, right? Truths that are so plain and so firm that they command assent. They have authority in and of themselves. You don't have to place any other kind of authority with them because they themselves are self-evident, which is authority enough. And we're going to talk a little bit about that later. And then he goes on, and to justify ourselves in the independent stand we are compelled to take. Neither aiming at originality of principle or sentiment, so again, I wasn't trying to be original, nor yet copied from any particular and previous writing. So even I wasn't trying to be original, but I also didn't specifically copy it from anybody. In another quote, he actually says, I didn't have any books or documents laid out before me as I penned the Declaration of Independence. So he didn't copy anything directly over. So now here he gives us some clues on how to speak the language of liberty. He said, it was intended to be an expression of the American mind, and to give that expression the proper tone and spirit called for by the occasion. We're going to go into some detail about this this evening now, about those key things. Capturing the expression of the American mind, do it with the proper tone and spirit. And how do we know what tone and spirit? Well, that's called for by the occasion. So the occasion with which we are speaking or communicating will totally dictate the tone and spirit that we use. And then he goes on, all its authority, so the Declaration, all the Declaration's authority rests then on the harmonizing sentiments It's a key word there, harmonizing. What does that word mean, harmonizing? Getting along, majority, unison, right? Okay. That's really key for language of liberty. Capturing the expression of the mind of your audience, making sure that you're in harmony with your audience. So that gives authority to what the communication is, what's happening there. So the harmonizing sentiments of the day, whether expressed in conversation, in letters, printed essays, or in the elementary books of public right, as Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, Sidney, etc. So we've got some great clues there from Jefferson. Now, before we go into too much detail about what Jefferson taught us there, let's talk a little bit about words and the power of words and language. Are words powerful? Right. Is anybody familiar with the study of general semantics? Semantics is kind of a study of meaning of words, right? But general semantics is this study. It's a very small little group of people that study it, and one of the most popular scholars in general semantics actually says that there probably is only no more than 20 people on the earth that actually are following this theory of general semantics. What it basically says is that words are symbols, and they represent the things that they are symbolizing. They are not the things, and so we need to totally separate them from the things. General semantics would say that if you are deathly afraid of large dogs and you hear the word Rottweiler, it should not put fear in you. You need to separate the word from the thing. Now, I think they go too far because I believe that words are far more powerful and they shouldn't be completely separated. In fact, how amazing is language and words? I mean, I can share with you an experience, and you can actually feel a little bit of my own experiences because of the words that I'm using. Or how about an experience that I share with you that took place in 1746, an event that I certainly was not present, but yet I was able to communicate emotion and thoughts in you with that story that I began with, right? Words are very powerful, and it's an amazing thing that we've created as humans to be able to communicate, to be able to pass on thoughts and emotions and ideas on to others. And so with general semantics, they go way too far. They're correct in the sense that when you hear the word Rottweiler, you should not break out in a cold sweat and get into the fetal position and not go anywhere. But you shouldn't separate the word so much so that when you hear the word, that you just absolutely ignore it, and if somebody yells Rottweiler, and you've separated that word so much from the actual dog, you don't even pay attention, and then suddenly you realize that dog's coming to get you. So we do need to not separate it as much as general semantics, but we do need to recognize what words are for. Words are symbolic of the things that we're trying to express. Now, words are extremely powerful, though. They bring things to pass. That's one thing that this nation has proven, that the power of the word, the power of language, the power of the pen, and to a large degree is far more powerful than the power of the sword, especially in longevity. It is much more enduring. So let's take a look at a couple of phrases that the Founding Fathers penned. We hold these truths. All men are created equal, separate, and equal station. We the people and person shall be eligible to the office of president. Now, all of these phrases are either in the Declaration or in the Constitution. Now, were these phrases the reality of the Founders' Day? Let me explain the last one, because you might not understand how the last one relates to all the others. So, does the Constitution specifically mention women? It does not. Who else does it not specifically mention when we're talking about genders? Who else is there? There's only two genders, regardless of what society is trying to tell you today. So it doesn't mention women, but it also doesn't mention men. Well, now that's interesting. Haven't you been told that the document is a male chauvinist document that was only there for a bunch of white rich guys? It doesn't mention men. It says a person shall be 35 years old to be eligible to the office of president. A person shall be in order to be a representative. A person shall be in order to be a senator. A person. It's gender neutral. When the founders were getting together trying to figure out who should be able to vote for the only single public, federal office that we originally voted for, what was that? What was the only office that we voted for according to the original Constitution? The what? House of Representatives, that's right. We didn't vote for president, still technically don't. We didn't vote for our senators, we only voted for the House. And when the founders were talking about who should be able to vote, property owners, yeah, men, yeah, and then they started getting into should women, what age group, all this kind of stuff. And finally they realized, wait a minute, why are we even making this decision? Why don't we just say whoever the state says can vote in their popular assembly can automatically vote for House of Representatives? So in some states that would be 18, some would be 21, some states might be male, some states might be female, or both, or all different types of qualifications. So the founders did not prohibit women from voting or holding public office in the federal Constitution. But could they vote and hold federal office? No, not at the time. It was not the reality of their day. Were all men created equal in 1787 or in 1776 when that was written? No, I mean they were, but we weren't acting that way, right? We still had slavery and indentured servitude and all those kinds of things. Separate and equal station, same thing with slavery. We the people, was it all we the people that were participating in the process? No. So these were not the reality of their day. Is it the reality of our day? Can women vote? Okay, so the last one's a reality. There's self-evident truths that the founders were experimenting with that we've now been able to prove are real truths. All men are created equal for the most part. We're still working on a few of them, but compared to their day, aren't these now the reality of ours? So when you use words and you communicate them and you especially pen them, they're powerful. If we speak the language of liberty today, we will have liberty tomorrow. If you speak the language of captivity today, you will have captivity tomorrow. Ralph?
For about half my life or more, the expression men are created equal, I never believed that because my idea of equality is different than what was intended to be understood there.
Well, with the founders, we were created equal in only three ways. We were created equal in our rights, we were created equal under the law, and created equal in the sight of God. Other than that, all bets are off. We are not equal in any other way.
I didn't understand that.
Yeah, and nature never intended us to be equal in any other way. And when we try to make ourselves equal in any other way, then we actually make ourselves unequal under the rights and under the law. Of course, in the sight of God, we don't control that one at all. So words are powerful. In fact, there's a great quote often attributed to Gandhi, but it's actually attributed to a lot of people. Watch your thoughts, they become words. Watch your words, they become actions. Watch your actions, they become habits. Watch your habits, they become your character. Watch your character, it becomes your destiny. So words are powerful. They do things. Shane had talked earlier about the gay and lesbian community and the successes they've had in 30 years. And so much of it is just language. It's words. The words they're using and the phrases that they're using.
Just really quick, as we were talking about the Declaration of Independence, my son leaned over to me and he said, my teacher told me exactly that it was written by a bunch of white men who didn't, and it's not relevant to us now. His history teacher told him that.
Time to get a new history teacher.
That's terrible. Because there's nothing in the document. Nothing in the document that indicates. In fact, if it was really a document written for a bunch of these rich white guys, then it would have been a document of them getting in bed with Parliament to make sure that they created monopolies for their industries to make them more rich. they put their lives in the line for that document. And many of them did lose their fortunes as a result. Okay, let's talk a little bit about a couple of definitions. I'm going to skip through a couple of these. Language is the expression of ideas by words for the communication of thoughts, or it's the usage of words made the representative of ideas. I'm going to jump to the fourth definition here. It's my favorite. When two or more persons customarily annex the same sounds, so we all make this sound, whether it sounds like a word or we can even just make a grunting noise. But if we annex that sound and those two people agree that that sound means this, so this means the same ideas, then the expression of these sounds by one person communicates his ideas to another. So it's all about communicating our ideas, taking them from one person to the next. And this is incredibly important that we recognize what communication and language truly is if we're actually to speak and reach out with the language of liberty. Now, is it important when you're communicating, say, with your spouse or family member, somebody close to you, is it important that you're on the same page with what words mean certain things and what phrases mean certain things, right? Pretty essential, okay? Sure you guys saw this, right? Do you want to have this argument? Is the dress gold and white or blue and black? How many here see gold and white? How many see blue and black? You guys want to have an argument? Many of you are familiar with this. You know, this came out, a year or two ago, and the heated arguments in the social networks was just phenomenal about people, how angry they were because they can't come to any kind of conclusion or any kind of agreement what this dress means in terms of color. My children, I've got 4 kids. 2 of them see the white and gold dress, and 2 of them see the blue and black. And they're beside themselves with each other, trying to figure out how can you possibly see. Now, by the way, there is no right or wrong answer here unless you see the blue and black, then you're wrong. Because I see the white and gold. So, actually, in reality, if you were to see the physical dress, it's actually a blue and black dress. But the point is about this is we've got to make sure that we're always on the same page. Otherwise, we will never be able to communicate with each other. Now, this next example, many of you have probably seen, but just to illustrate the point here, I want to kind of go through this exercise anyway. So what I'm going to have is everybody on the side portions, if you guys can just kind of turn your head so you don't see the screen. Can you do that? Turn away so you don't see the screen. And just the middle people are going to look at the screen. Now, when you look at the screen, I want you to read the words, not out loud. Just read them silently to yourself. You good? Okay. Now, those of you that were looking down, you can now look up. And those of you that were looking at the screen now, I need you to not look at the screen, okay? Now, those that are looking at the screen, you go ahead and just read silently the words to yourselves. Okay. Everybody can look at the screen now. Now, a couple people from over here, give me a couple of descriptive words, adjectives for this picture. Young? Old? What do you say? Ugly? Over here we said young. You're saying ugly. Old. Are we communicating the same thing here? Are we looking at the same thing?
I see both. I can flip it back and forth.
You can see both of them? Can everybody see both images? Okay. You've got the lady's nose there with her eyes, and she's looking off into the distance. That's a young lady. This is her necklace. The old lady's the big nose, chin, mouth. Okay. But if we don't recognize that we're communicating about the same thing, then we will never be able to communicate, right? We've got to understand exactly where each other are and from what lens we're looking at life through in order to be able to communicate effectively.
We have who's on first, what's on second. I don't know who's on third.
That's what I want to find out. I want you to tell me the names of the fellas on the St. Louis team.
I'm telling you, who's on first, what's on second. I don't know who's on third.
You know the fellas' names?
Yes.
Well, then who's playing first?
Yes.
I mean the fellow's name on first base.
Who?
The fellow playing first base for St. Louis.
Who?
The guy on first base.
Who is on first?
Well, what are you asking me for?
I'm not asking you, I'm telling you, who is on first?
I'm asking you who's on first.
That's the man's name.
That's whose name?
Yes.
Well, go ahead and tell me.
Who?
The guy on first.
Who?
The first baseman.
Who is on first?
Have you got a first baseman on first?
Certainly.
Then who's playing first?
Absolutely.
When you pay off the first baseman every month, who gets the money?
Every dollar of it. Why not? The man's entitled to it.
Who is?
Yes.
So who gets it?
Why shouldn't he? Sometimes his wife comes down and collects it.
Whose wife?
Yes. After all, the man earns it.
Who does?
Absolutely.
Well, what I'm trying to find out is what's the guy's name on first base?
No. What is on second base?
I'm not asking you who's on second.
Who's on first?
That's what I'm trying to find
Well,
out.
don't change the players.
I'm not changing nobody.
Take it easy.
What's the guy's name on first base?
What's the guy's name on second base?
I am not asking you who's on second.
Who's on first?
I don't know.
He's on third. We're not talking about him.
How did I get on third base?
You mentioned his name.
If I mention a third baseman's name, who did I say is playing third?
No, who's playing first?
Stay off of first, will you?
Well, what do you want me to do?
Now, what's the guy's name on third base?
What's on second?
I'm not asking you who's on second.
Who's on first?
I don't know.
He's on third.
There I go, back on third again.
Well, I can't change their names.
Will you please stay on third base, Mr. Broadhurst?
Now, what is it you want to know?
What is the fella's name on third base?
What is the fella's name on second base?
I'm not asking you who's on second.
Who's on first?
I don't know. Third base.
Were they speaking the same language? They were not communicating at all because they did not agree on the same words for the same things at the same time. So they were not using the proper tone and spirit called for by the occasion. They didn't capture the expression of each other's mind. They had it all backwards. So communication is not the words you use. Communication is the thoughts, emotions, and actions that you instill in those that you're communicating with. If you have left your audience with different thoughts than you intended, then you have failed to communicate. And the burden is on you. You're the one that's communicating. And so if your audience misunderstands you and you get upset, you're an idiot. How can you not understand me? It's not their fault. It's your fault. Because you are the one that is trying to take your ideas and instill it in them. So it's important that we recognize that. And when I'm talking about your audience, I'm talking about anywhere from an audience of one person to about 6 or 7 billion people. So really just whoever you're communicating with, whether it's individuals or whether it's a large group or whatever. Now, let's talk specifically now about communicating the language of liberty. There's a couple of, the one important thing that we've discovered that helps us recognize when we're speaking the language of liberty is to recognize its opposite, which is the language of captivity. And so we're going to kind of go into a little bit of detail about that. And so a couple of the things that we need to do, first of all, you've got to speak the language of liberty, not the language of captivity, which means you need to be positive, optimistic, and forward-thinking. Shane, could I have you help me pass a couple of things out here? Grab one. So I'm passing out a bookmark for each of you, and you'll notice on one side it has some characteristics, which you'll see up here on the screen, of the language of liberty. And on the other side it has the characteristics of the language of captivity. So if you leave your audience with these characteristics, and you have spoken the language of liberty. So selflessness, positive, optimistic, forward-thinking, hopeful, enlightening, empowering, enabling. vision, happiness, motivating, protecting, maintaining, perpetuating, defending, informing, uniting, inclusive, and above all, love. So if you've done that, if you've left your audience that way, then you've spoken the language of liberty. Now on the other side, you'll see the language of captivity. If you leave your audience with feelings, contrarian feelings, contention, destructive, limiting, oppressive, fearful, doomsday, hopelessness, suppression, subjugation, selfish attacks, manipulative, divisive, war, conflict, confusion, and you leave them feeling lonely and contempt, then you've spoken the language of captivity. Now it's key when you notice above each of those, it says if you leave your audience with these characteristics. Now the reason why that's key is because there's no question, as you're communicating with somebody and you're trying to help them understand the difficult situation that we are in this country, you're going to bring some of these feelings and emotions into the hearts and minds of your audience, won't you? Yeah. But never leave them that way. Okay? Never tell them that even after this 6 years of fighting so hard, we are less free today than we were 6 years ago. Don't walk away from that comment. You need to then add, but that's good news. Because tyrants always start pushing down when people are rising up and freedom. We're on the brink of freedom when that happens. So it's exciting, let's keep it up. You see, don't ever leave them feeling despair or feeling like their time's been wasted or any of these. Leave them feeling uplifted, positive, optimistic, forward-thinking. Does that make sense? We already went to that. So let's look at some examples. So if I'm in this audience right now, knowing who I'm talking to, and I use words like fight, battle, or war, this is your interpretation of that. You look at it as this is the political process, a couple politicians standing up there debating, no big deal, America's great that we can all communicate this way and have this freedom of thought and ideas. And so that's your interpretation. But you know the general public does not interpret fight, battle, and war those ways. When it comes to politics, and you use the words fight, battle, and war, this is how the general public looks at it. It's a fist fight. It's very difficult to recruit people into a fist fight. If you're trying to get your neighbors involved in the movement, protecting our freedoms, don't ever say you need to come help us fight and go to war. Really difficult to recruit people to that. People don't want to get involved in fistfights. So instead, we would use words like protect, win, bring peace, right? Positive, optimistic, and forward-thinking. See, protect, win, and bring peace is the positive, optimistic result of fighting, battling, and war, right? But people want to see the end. They want to know that they are on the winning side. They want to know that that their time and energy is going to be well used. And so protect, win, and bring peace. So likewise, you're not going to say, join us in fighting for your freedoms to somebody that's just an everyday person that doesn't get involved much in politics, because this is how they look at it. You can't fight City Hall. They don't want to go up against the government, the IRS, and they don't want to go up against all these things that they know can just squash them. So you're not talking about fighting for their freedom. Come join us in winning your freedom, right? We got them on the run. Let's go. We can win this. We've got it. This is amazing stuff. So does this make sense? All right, depends on who your audience is. This is exactly what Jefferson is talking about when Jefferson says, capturing the expression of the American mind. You've got to capture the mind of your audience. So often we get frustrated when we can't use certain words because the media has destroyed it or the left has destroyed those words. And so we insist on using those words. A few weeks ago, or a month or so ago, K. Carl Smith presented at this meeting. And those of you who are here, do you remember some of the words he said that you just absolutely cannot use in a southern black community? What's one of the key words he said? Conservative. No matter how much you want to use that word because you know what it means to you, it means somebody who is God-fearing. It means somebody who believes in fundamental principles of liberty. It means somebody who wants to protect our rights, right? Isn't that what conservative means to you? But you use that word in a black Southern community, and what does it mean to them? Slavery. A lot of people think it means, a bunch of racist Tea Partiers, and it kind of does, but you know what's actually embedded in them? It's not a bunch of racist conservative Tea Partiers or Republicans. It is Jim Crow laws, conservative Democrats. See, Democrats back in the Jim Crow days, they called themselves conservative Democrats. And so conservative was the word that was used back in the 50s and 60s. And so that's what's ingrained in them is conservative means racism, means KKK. So why would you ever use the word conservative when you know that even though to you it means a freedom-loving constitutionalist, but to them, they're seeing in their mind KKK, racist, Jim Crow, right? So you can't use words if you're trying to communicate your ideas to another. So if you're trying to communicate ideas of freedom and rights to a Southern black community, what word are you going to use? Or what words would you use? Freedom's always a good word, absolutely. What words wouldn't you use? I just gave you a big clue. Conservative, right? You're not going to use conservative. You're going to have to stay away from Constitution and to some degree Declaration of Independence and things. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, about why we don't always have to be quoting the founders or the documents or anything. Because again, sometimes even using those terms immediately puts in their head something different that you do not want in their head. If your goal is to get freedom in their head, then you need to realize that you've got to capture the expression of their mind, not yours. So often we speak to hear ourselves, don't we? We say the words that we want to hear. We say the words that make us sound brilliant. Oh man, I just sounded so brilliant to myself. Why you're not getting it, I don't understand. You must not be as brilliant as I am. You sound brilliant to yourself because you understand yourself perfectly. You've got to start putting yourself in the shoes of your audience. Pay attention to the lenses that they're looking through and use words and phrases that help put the image in their head that you want them to have. So it may be using totally different words. It may not be using totally different words. But you also have to understand who you are in relation to your audience. So for example, I'm up here, you know that I used to work for Tea Party Patriots, and I've been an activist for years in the liberty movement. And so if I stand up here and say, come join me and fight for your freedom, because I'm talking to liberty-loving people that are activists, you're all with me, right? You're ready to grab your signs, and you're ready to poke holes in the sky with your signs and get your bullhorns out and saying, kill that bill, and just get out there and just stop government from doing stuff. You're with me. But what if same audience, same words join us in fighting for your freedom, different presenter? What if I'm a 5-star general up here? Come join me in fighting for your freedom. Suddenly, the same words, same audience that was language of liberty to this audience now means taking up arms, going overseas, and putting your life on the line. Now that's suddenly captivity to some of you. Some of you are, oh yeah, I'm all for it, let's go. But to many of you, that's now captivity, right? So you've got to know who you are to your audience. A handful of years ago, when the whole movement started, 5-6 years ago, the city of Gilbert, town of Gilbert, decided to pass a couple of tax increases. And so we put a group or a team together, and we purposely didn't have that team be public. And the reason why is because we knew that the moment our names were attached to something, that it automatically placed that thing in a certain box. The moment somebody heard the name Bill Norton, it automatically meant some crazy, wacko, right-wing extremist that was anti-government. That's the perception that some people have of me in my community. And so the moment your name is attached to something, that's the box that they are now looking through. Don't fight it. That's just simply how they're seeing you. If you want to try to change your image, by all means, do whatever you can to do that. But recognize when you're communicating with others, that is how every single word that comes out of your mouth is now coming through the filter of crazy right-wing conservative. Right? And with what the media has done, they hear you're part of the Tea Party, crazy right-wing racist conservative. Now that's every word coming out of your mouth is going through that filter. So you have to know who you are in relation to your audience. So here's a great example. There's a left-wing organization out of Washington, D.C. that put together a campaign in Texas. They looked at Texas and they realized, as we look at some of these election results, we think Texas can be flipped from red to blue, and probably at the very least we can make it purple. And so they put together an incredibly organized campaign, very, very well funded, and they came into Texas and they called it Battleground Texas. Left-wing Washington, D.C. based organization coming into another state and setting up Battleground Texas. Language of liberty or language of captivity to the citizens of Texas. What do you think? Captivity, why? Texas is free. They're independent. Washington, D.C. organization coming in saying that you're going to turn our land into the battleground? Who are you to come into our state and do this? So luckily there is another Washington, D.C. organization on the right that came into the rescue with, come and take it. Language of liberty, language of captivity. Liberty? Excuse me. Any other ideas? Liberty, captivity? Every group that I present this to has always said liberty, except for a couple of groups, and guess where those groups are? Texas. Whenever I've ever presented this in Texas, every time, captivity. It doesn't matter whether it's a Washington, D.C. group that's leftist or on the right. You're coming into our state to create a battle here in our state to say whether we're going to be red or blue. We will decide whether we're red or blue. And so even though this conservative organization came in, they still said, come and take it. Come and take it. It's not yours to declare, come and take it. Language of captivity. So I had a friend of mine, a colleague, she worked for Tea Party Patriots as well, and this is right when we were doing language of liberty stuff. And she calls me up and she says, Bill, she lives in Texas. She said, Bill, I need to combat this. Nobody is liking any of this stuff that's happening. Help me come up with a name for a grassroots campaign that is language of liberty. So she had called me, we had that conversation right when I was getting on the airplane. So as soon as we took off, I pulled my laptop out, jumped online, and started searching. The first thing I did was just Googled Texas. And of course went to Wikipedia, right? I wanted to know who. I wanted to capture the expression of the Texan mind. Who are Texans? Now that's a big mind. They have big heads in Texas, let me tell you. So the first thing that I saw on Wikipedia was perfect. The Texas National Anthem. So I didn't put any of my own ideas in this. I didn't say, oh, this left-wing organization is doing this and this right-wing organization is doing this. What should I do? The first thing I said was, what would Texans want? Capture the expression of the mind of Texans. To get myself out of there. Find out who my audience is. And there it was on Wikipedia, the Texas State Anthem. Anybody know the Texas State Anthem? You want to sing it for us? Anybody know the name or the title of the Texas State Anthem? It became the perfect title for this campaign. So this is how Texans looked at this. They looked at it as a fist fight between two Washington, D.C. organizations that they were caught in the middle. So we created this campaign called Texas, our Texas. It didn't say we're going to turn it red. It didn't say we're going to turn it blue. It said, get out of here, it's our state. Right? Language of liberty. And it personalized it because this is the title of their state anthem, Texas, our Texas. So this is a great example of language of liberty. And something interesting as well is the fact that every group that I present this to says that come and take it is liberty, except for Texans themselves. Steve?
There was a movement in Texas some years back where they were pushing an anti-littering campaign, and they used the music of the fabulous Thunderbirds and a theme song and signs along the roadways that don't mess with Texas. The whole goal, the whole attitude of Texas is right there in that whole thing.
Absolutely.
And that appealed very well, and that campaign was very successful.
Texans are very patriotic. Absolutely. You know who else is very patriotic is Tennesseans. Do you know that when you stand up and do the Pledge of Allegiance, that they also have a Tennessee Pledge of Allegiance to their flag? And every meeting I've ever been to in Tennessee, they do both. It's very, very patriotic with their state. So yes, Texans. So great example here of language of liberty. So the other thing that Jefferson talks about is that we need to do so in the proper tone and spirit. So we need to speak with both our heart and with our mind. Now, when Jefferson says tone and spirit, which one do you think is heart and which one do you think is mind? Tone and spirit. Which one's heart and mind? Spirit is heart, so tone must be mind. And that's exactly what Mark and I were thinking originally until we started reading some definitions. So Jefferson, this is of course where he put it in the quote. We're going to skip that. Tone is actually the heart. In the 1828 dictionary, it says a quality, feeling, or attitude expressed by the words that someone uses in speaking or writing. Okay, so it's a feeling or attitude, whereas the spirit is actually the mind. It's the temper, disposition of mind, habitual or temporary. An immaterial intelligent substance. Spirit is a substance in which thinking, knowing, doubting, and a power of moving do exist. So we need to learn how to speak with both the spirit, both the heart and the mind. How often do we get out there and we try to use logic and reason when we're communicating with somebody? Right? We'll get out there and we'll talk about welfare, for example, and we'll start giving a bunch of statistics. You know, more people have more babies when they're on welfare because it's, more money, and then this many people stay on welfare, and whenever you do this, and what happens when you do that to a friend or a neighbor? Their eyes glass over, goes right over. They're not interested in all those statistics. So then you get passionate and you get furious. How can they not understand this? This is crazy. And then you start talking about how the people on welfare are just a bunch of freeloaders and they shouldn't be sucking off the system and they should be sterilized so they don't have more kids and they should. Now how do you sound? Like an extremist, and like you do not care for the needy and the poor, which is actually very far from the truth. Statistically, conservatives give far more to charitable organizations than liberals do. And so we know that's not true. We know that you love and care for the poor. So try Franklin's approach. Franklin said, I am for doing good to the poor, but I differ in opinion of the means. I think the best way of doing good to the poor is not making them easy in poverty, but leading them or driving them out of it. In my youth, I traveled much, and I observed in different countries that the more public provisions were made for the poor, the less they provided for themselves, and of course became poorer. And on the contrary, the less was done for them, the more they did for themselves and became richer. Now, is there any question how Benjamin Franklin feels about the poor after reading this? He starts right out, I'm for doing good to the poor, but I recognize that you might have a different opinion, and I have a different opinion, but let me share with you my personal experience. So he personalizes it. In my travels in my youth, so he personalizes it, makes it part of him. Instead of a bunch of statistics, he's made it a personal thing and allows the people to connect. And then, how do we really know that we've helped the poor? If they become richer, right? And not poorer. So in his observations, he discovered if you do this, they become poorer. If you do this, they become richer. And I'm for doing good for the poor, so I want richer. So we do less for them. You see? He gave you all the logical arguments, but he also used his heart in there as well. He connected, okay? So in order to get it into our heart and mind, we've got to do a few things. First of all, we've got to immerse ourselves in the principles of liberty. All right, we've got to dive into them. And so the way that we immerse ourselves is we need to first learn it. Now, many of you, of course, are familiar with the 5,000-year leap, right? All right, Shane, I've got another giveaway here. I don't know how many you'll need there, but there's a stack for you. So what I'm handing out now, it's a little bit deceptive because it's got the language of liberty cover on it, but it is not this presentation. What it actually is the National Center for Constitutional Studies gave me permission to do a kind of Cliff Notes version of the 5,000-year leap. So this gives you a very nice, quick reference guide. It has all 28 principles, and it just has a couple of paragraphs and a couple of quotes on that principle. So I give that to you because it's so important that we learn the principles of liberty. We should read and reread the 5,000-year leap at least every couple of years. And it will keep you immersed in those principles. And this booklet here just gives you a nice quick reference guide. Now, once you immerse yourselves and you study the principles, then you need to try to live the principles. This is probably one of the hardest things to do, but actually live them. You'll notice as you go through the 28 principles that these are 28 principles not for the federal government, but for good governance in general. And so when we're talking about different levels of government, what is the smallest governmental unit of society? The family, and then let's go down one more level, the individual, right? Isn't that what this life is all about, is learning how to govern this? And so that's, so we can actually take these principles and we can implement them in every level of government. Now, when you get down to the individual, you can't quite implement all of them. For example, don't try the separation of powers as an individual. It's tough. Don't try that one. But as a family, it's an amazing thing. Separation of powers, checks and balances. Women, we love you. We love you. We love how emotional you are. We love how nurturing you are, how kind you are, how gentle, how wonderful you are with our children. We love you. But doggone it, sometimes that emotion, whew, it gets out there, right? So you need us cold, calloused, hard-hearted men to come in and kind of balance that, right? What a beautiful thing, this check and balance. Separation of powers, checks and balances, even within your own family. So you can live these principles. Be as free as you claim that you want to be. If I was to go through all the different entitlements that government offers, you would be shaking your head, yeah, that's terrible, they shouldn't do that. Why in the world are they doing that? Why are we spending money on that? I guarantee I would finally come across one that you'd say, oh, wait a minute, no, we need that one because it's something that affects you or a family member or whatever. Folks, be as free as you claim to want to be, right? Did you have a comment about that, Cindy? Looked like you were getting ready to say something. Absolutely be as free as you want to be, or as you claim that you want to be, and recognize that we've got to be intellectually honest with ourselves when we say we want freedom. The next thing we need to do is be able to hear the language of liberty. So listen to others. Don't just do all the talking, listen to others. And then we need to be able to observe it. What's the best way to observe language of liberty? The easiest way to observe it, well, listening helps, is to observe history, study history. Because then we can observe not only what happened at the time, but what the result was. Did it result in freedom? Did it result? And then we need to teach it and perpetuate it. Get to the point where when you learn a principle of liberty, you cannot sit still until you've imparted that into the heart or mind of another. And when we do that, we'll be able to speak it. Now, let's get into some really tough stuff. Actually, let me jump back here. To speak the language of liberty, you have to genuinely want freedom for all, including your political foes. This is a tough thing. But if you really want to speak the language of liberty, you have got to want freedom for everybody. Because remember, the moment you don't want your political foes to be free, you're going to be bringing in contention. It's going to be limiting. You're going to be the oppressor. You're going to want to suppress them. It's going to be divisive and conflict. So we're going to bring up some very challenging quotes from Thomas Jefferson. If there be any among us who would wish to dissolve this union or to change its republican form, or hypothetically, let's say somebody stands up and say, we are 5 days away from the fundamental transformation of America, let them stand undisturbed as monuments of the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated, where reason is left free to combat it. Let them stand undisturbed. Because the only way that we can disturb them or to silence them would be to bring captivity upon them. And if we bring captivity upon them, who we end up bringing, in the long run, who do we bring captivity upon? Ourselves. If we silence our political foes, especially using government force, then we in turn silence ourselves, right? And so we've got to be careful. Now, Jefferson is not saying let them stand unanswered. That's what he's saying at the end, where reason is left free to combat it. Now, in order for reason to be left free to combat it, freedom of speech has to be totally free, so that we can stand up and say, no. That is an incorrect principle. Here's the correct principle. So we're not saying, when he's saying let them stand undisturbed, he's not saying let them stand unanswered. He's just saying let's not institute policies that would silence them. Now, while the desired policies of your foes may cause damage, there's actually some positive effects, even if your foes are wrong and have some bad policies. Protecting the rights of others will in turn help you to protect your own rights. So, for example, right now these two individuals, one has $20, one has $10. They are now protected under the law and in their rights with their property. But say we decide, this is no longer fair. We want to pass a law that equalizes things. So right now they're protected. Equal in their rights and under the law, but unequal in things. But we want to pass a law that makes them equal in things. Now what do? What does the law say? $20 person has to give $5 to the $10 person. They now have $15. Now they're equal. Isn't this great? Of course, we just made them unequal in their rights, but nevertheless, they're equal in things. So his property is not protected, and so he lost rights. This gentleman here lost rights, and he gained things. Now, did the green gentleman here, did he lose rights? He did. When? The moment he took the $5 from this gentleman, right? Because what happens if somebody else comes along and that law is on the books that still says, hey, we need to have equal things, right? So we've got to recognize that we have to strive to protect the rights and freedoms of others, even our political foes, because in the long run, it then protects us. Now, as I've been studying this, it really made some things come to light. It made me realize that when the scriptures teach us that we should pray for our enemies, of course they're not teaching us that we should pray that they should be successful over us. We're praying for what? For their souls. In this state, we're praying for their freedom. Pray for your enemy, for their freedom. And then when it says that we should lose ourselves in the service of others, look at what happens with this. If we are striving to protect the rights of our neighbors, we're not too concerned about ours, but we're concerned about our neighbors, and all of us were doing that together, now what happens to your rights? They're protected. And instead of being protected by one person, I could be standing here saying, I'm protecting my rights. I'm one person, I'm an island. But if I go out and start protecting everybody's, and they start protecting everybody else's, now I have millions of people protecting my rights, not just me. So it's essential that even though we might strongly disagree with our political foes, we need to love them and want freedom for them. That's why that last thing on the characteristics of language of liberty was above all, love. And it's hard to do, really hard to do. Jefferson said, I know no safe depository of the ultimate powers of society but the people themselves. And if we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their control with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it from them. So if we think they're wrong, we shouldn't take their freedom from them. Instead, we need to try to inform their discretion by education. This is the only true corrective of abuses of constitutional power. Then he goes on, the involvement of the people on the side of government has had a great effect. He said, I am persuaded myself that the good sense of the people, lost my place, will always be found to be the best army. They may be led astray for a moment, but will soon correct themselves. The people are the only censors of their governors, and even their errors will tend to keep these to the true principles of their institution. Isn't that interesting? Even when we're wrong, just because we're engaged, then we can help keep our government within its proper bounds. So that's why our political foes shouldn't be silenced as well, is because they help us. When we, the people, are out here, we need to realize that we're not enemies really with our political foes. We are trying to protect our freedoms from a government tyranny that would take those freedoms. So when you have citizens, whether they're on the right or on the left, that are actively involved with the government, they keep that government within its proper bounds. How do you get people involved? You don't need many people involved. Just like Shane mentioned earlier, you don't need many. In fact, that's one thing that the Center for Self-Governance is teaching. These teams that are going out and really learning how to be very effective in interacting with their government. We're finding that it's taking very few people but we've got to do it correctly, and we've got to do it with the right language, and you've got to do it in a way that you're not finger pointing at a politician. Cindy, I'm going to ask you to speak for Andy for a minute, for President Biggs. If he has somebody that comes in and starts pointing finger in his chest saying, you need to do this, I can't believe you did this, how effective is that going to be compared to somebody who might be a total political foe that says, Andy, I had some different ideas here, I liked what you did over here, but, maybe we should consider this. Which one's going to be the most effective? What's that? I don't think the finger pointing thing is going to be very good, even if it's one of his friends or political allies. You start communicating in a way that's just abrasive, and it's just not going to be very effective.
Well, I can speak for other legislators because I have worked there, and it's totally a turn on when somebody comes in and attacks a legislator, even in an email, and they're angry and venting. They just discount it. A lot of them just delete the email.
Yep. Yeah, you wouldn't like it to be done to yourself, so certainly don't do it to somebody else. So Jefferson goes on, cherish therefore the spirit of our people and keep alive their attention. Now this is an amazing portion of the quote from Jefferson. Keep in mind, Jefferson at this time, he was an ambassador to France. He was, he'd already been the governor of Virginia. He had been delegate to Congress a couple of times. He was eventually going to be vice president within a couple of years of this, 18 months of this or so. He said, and he was writing this letter to another public official. He said, do not be too severe upon their errors, but reclaim them by enlightening them. If once they become inattentive to the public affairs, you and I and Congress and assemblies, judges and governors shall all become wolves. Here's one of the greatest freedom-loving minds in the history of the world that said, if I'm in power and you are not engaged, I will become a wolf. What an amazing thing from Thomas Jefferson. So we've got to be involved. So we need to realize that our political foes, being shoulder to shoulder with us involved, is a good thing. Even though their results might be bad, just their involvement is a good thing. So the involvement of citizens, even when they're wrong, provides a check on the government. Okay, let me jump ahead to a couple other things real quick here, since we're getting close to the end. Okay, this is a point that I've recently been studying, and it's been very enlightening for me. We do not always need to invoke God or the founders to give additional authority. Self-evidence is the authority. Remember when Jefferson said to bring things so plain and so firm that they commanded assent, right? It's self-evident, not Jefferson evident. When we use quotes from the founders, we've got to pay attention to who our audience is. If I'm using quotes among you, quotes from the founders are great. But if I'm, again, in a black Southern community and I'm using a quote from Thomas Jefferson, what lens are they now looking at it through? Slave owner, right? And no matter how much we want to say about how great Jefferson was and about how well he treated his slaves and things, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter even if we could prove that he never owned slaves, which he did, but even if we could prove that, they still are looking at it through that lens. And so the moment we take and we teach a self-evident truth and we attach a quote from a founder to it with somebody who's going to have a negative view of that, now that principle is no longer self-evident, it's now Jefferson evident, which in their case might be negative evident. It might actually steer them away from that principle instead of guide them toward it. Now pay attention to why you're using quotes from the founders as well. I've paid a close attention to this, and I've realized that one of the main reasons why I use a quote from the founder is because I want to try to silence that person sometimes. Sometimes I use it for education, other times I use it to win a debate. It's because I'll use a Jefferson quote because if you disagree with me, you're disagreeing with Jefferson. And so if you're doing that, what have you just spoken? Language of captivity. Because your goal is to manipulate the discretion of your audience and bring them into captivity. Because you're trying to win a debate. And so I've realized, and I've tried to stop myself whenever I'm doing that, whenever I'm trying to use a quote solely for the purpose of silencing the other party. So only use quotes and things when you know that it's going to serve its purpose, to inspire, to uplift, to further the cause of liberty. And you do not always need to use a quote from the founders in order to teach a self-evident truth. They are self-evident. They have authority in and of themselves. And then that last portion that first portion I mentioned there about invoking God. I've watched this with presenters and people speaking quite a bit lately, and I've noticed something interesting. There's two ways to invoke God into a conversation. And the way that the founders always did it was out of appreciation and with gratitude and thankfulness. If you notice somebody that stands up and they'll say, I prayed about this, and this is the way that we need to do this, and this is the cause, this is the way how is that usually received by the audience? Who died and made you God, right? It normally is received, and why do we usually do that? If we do that, what are we doing it for? Aren't we doing it to silence them? You cannot question me, because if you question me, since it was from God, you're questioning God. So be careful. Now, I'm not saying don't use God. In fact, share your inspired moments with friends, and in certain circumstances, in certain audiences, you might share some inspired moments, where God touched you. But don't use it to silence the person or to make it so that nobody can question you, because now you're bringing them into captivity. So like Benjamin Franklin, he could have stood there at the convention and said, we are so backwards here, we're wrong, we're way off base, we have got to start praying. And I prayed about it, and God said, you need to pray about it. No, instead Benjamin Franklin said, the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of man. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? And then he goes on and talks about how prayers were answered when they did it during the revolutionary period. In this very room, he said, they were answered and they were heard and graciously answered. And so you see, he personalizes it and never gets preachy with it. He invokes God in a thankful, humble heart. And so just pay attention when you're communicating. Are you trying to bring your audience into submission, or are you trying to inspire them and leave them feeling happier and better? And it's the same thing with most people when we even talk about restoring our country, restoring the Constitution. Do you know how the general public perceives that? When we poll that phraseology, do you know how the general public receives that? Going backwards. Going back to when women couldn't vote. Going back to slavery. Yes, they see positives as well. Going back to, good old apple pie and Americana and founding fathers. So there is positive as well, but they see the negative. People don't like to go backwards. They like to go forward. So we don't go back to where the founding fathers were. We continue to build on their principles and bring mankind further than even the founding fathers were able to, because they still had things like slavery and stuff like that. We can do it. We know from their experiment what works and what doesn't work. We can progress mankind further than mankind has ever gone before. So always bring people forward. That's why. Why do you think Obama uses forward? Why do you think progressives use the term progressive? It's because people like to feel like they are moving forward and progressing. Thomas Jefferson, I like the dreams of the future better than the history of the past. So don't question what I'm saying, because I just used the big man here, right? Okay. We'll have to skip that because we're basically out of time. So Jefferson, one of my favorite quotes from him, enlighten the people. Enlighten the people, and tyranny and oppression will vanish like evil spirits at the dawn of day. And in order to speak the language of liberty, we've got to basically have that attitude. The attitude has got to be that of enlightenment. Recognize who your audience is, where they are, what lens or filter they're seeing life through, and communicate the principles of freedom and liberty based on that. And in order to do that, you will be able to connect to them a lot quicker if you love them, if you genuinely want freedom for them. Forget about your own liberty and rights. Put that on the back burner and go out and protect and care for and maintain the rights of others. And I promise when you do that, you will begin to naturally be able to speak the language of liberty. So with that, I leave you with one last admonition to simply go forth and proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. Thank you.